A word from our sponsors. Advertisers, are you ready to become a certified converged linear CTV and digital video media master? Introducing Nexen U, the online educational program dedicated to helping you better plan, buy, optimize, and measure your converged campaigns. Taught by industry leaders from both the buy and sell side, Nexen U experts tackle the challenging topics like data, identity, creative optimization, and more. So whether you're looking to fine-tune your existing skill set or dive deep into new concepts, Nexen U is the place to be. Enroll today at u.nexen.com. Again, that's u.nexen.com. Welcome to the AdTech God Pod, your window into the world of advertising technology and the people behind it. I'm your host, AdTech God. Welcome to the AdTech God Pod, your go-to for conversations with attorneys turned advertising CEOs. I'm excited to chat with Vanessa Otero, the CEO and founder of AdFontes. Some may be familiar with AdFontes and others may not, but in short, AdFontes Media rates news sources by reliability and political bias, which in essence helps readers navigate those news sources more confidently. This also comes into play with advertisers as they consider where they do and do not want to advertise. I'm looking forward to meeting Vanessa today. Vanessa, welcome to the AdTech God Pod.
Thanks so much for having me, AdTech God.
Thank you. It's nice to have an attorney on here. Nice to meet you. Love that you slightly pivoted into a different industry.
A little bit
slightly.
Different industry.
Can I ask you, I love to kind of understand where people come from and why they entered, the advertising or AdTech industry. Can you kind of go through how you moved from, being an attorney into starting AdFontes?
Absolutely. And I did not know, even starting AdFontes, that I would end up in the ad tech industry. So even more circuitous. I mean, my background, before I was a lawyer, I was in sales. I spent 10 years mostly in B2B sales. I went to law school, became a patent attorney. I ended up practicing for a total of 6 years. And I actually really liked my law job. I mean, you hear of a lot of lawyers who don't like the practice of law and they get burned out and they quit and they just do something else. But I actually really liked being a patent lawyer because of all the lawyer jobs. It's like you get to work with inventors and entrepreneurs, and it's a happy kind of law. You're not dealing with people in like the worst crises of their lives. Like you're helping them invent stuff. So I created AdFontes out of something that I was just tinkering with as a hobby, because I've said this on many appearances before, but I'm a giant nerd in like every sense. And I have always been super interested in like news and politics, but also like good argumentation. So I was an English major, I was a lawyer. So like words, rhetorical analysis, I just love that stuff. So in the run up to the 2016 election, I noticed that people were sharing a lot of unreliable news sources with each other and failing to convince each other because of the bias of those news sources. And I created this media bias chart, which was truly just a hobby to talk to my friends about the news sources they consume, and then went viral and just took over my life. I know you can relate about just like tinkering with something and
right.
And then it takes over your life.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
On social media in particular, because everybody on the internet had an opinion about the bias and reliability of the news sources that they and others consumed. So a ton of feedback. And it was just this project that took over my life. Like I kept, talking to folks about it and would come out with new versions of the chart based on feedback. And the things that people kept saying were like, what's the data behind this? And what's the methodology? And, can you add some more news sources? And then the other thing I would get was, well, this chart is biased because you're biased. And I was like, well, that's true. So how could I make it less biased and then like answer all these like questions that people had about the data and the methodology? So long story short, I mean, I ended up creating this whole company where we rate the news for reliability and bias. And that's what we are primarily. But it turns out in order to monetize that kind of data, you sort of have to build an ad tech company too. So we're an accidental ad tech company. I mean, 3.5 years ago, I didn't know what a DSP was. And now we're integrated in the major ones. I mean, the learning curve is very steep, but much like a journalism outlet is they primarily do a thing, which is like journalism. They also have to have this whole apparatus to plug into the advertising monetization. They have to build an AdTech capability. So that's how I view us in the AdTech world.
You mentioned as a patent lawyer, you were working with a lot of inventors and entrepreneurs. You think that helped you pull the trigger, just go and just do it and say, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I think I'm onto something good. I've seen these other entrepreneurs and inventors, and now I want to be one too.
Oh, for sure. Because I was in sales, and so I had this little entrepreneurial bug, and I still live in Westminster, Colorado, which is in between Denver and Boulder. And I practiced in Boulder. And this the Colorado startup community is pretty robust. It's not like San Francisco or New York, but it's quite robust. So I felt like it would be easy to get into the networks of the startup world. And I had a handful of contacts. I figured, maybe I could raise some money, like really build something. And I felt like that was within the realm. And I was like, it'll be hard, but
I think that's something I'm going through as well is I had to explain that if I'm not working, that who else is doing this? And so it turns into, when you work at a company with 20 people or 100 people or 10,000 people, you can step away and really not look at your phone or your email for a week. And the company just continues to move forward. With this, it's nearly impossible to step away for half a day without, checking and responding to someone. I think that's been the biggest learning for me is, holy crap, this is a lot more work than I ever thought.
I can totally relate.
So we've had some changes in our government recently. We have a new president. We're seeing some things changing in political landscape overall. You just published a great article with Ad Exchanger, and I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about it, if that's okay with you. So one of the things that you mentioned in that article is you highlight how some government officials are pressuring these advertisers to not spend on certain, political or conservative outlets. Can you kind of explain that to me and how the pressures that people get could conflict with First Amendment rights? Yeah.
Well, the issue is that there are, Jim Jordan, who's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Brendan Carr, who's about to be is the FCC commissioner, have, at various different stages, written letters or launched inquiries into advertising groups and in agencies and companies. And they're not pressuring them to advertise in a particular area. The inquiries are about whether these companies are choosing not to advertise on certain news outlets, particularly right-leaning news outlets. That's the accusation from Jim Jordan's committee, and then from Brendan Carr's accusations towards tech companies that they're censoring by somehow encouraging companies not to advertise next to conservative or right-leaning content, like on X or on certain news sites. So the First Amendment has various protections, and one of them is a right to free speech. The limitation is very heavy-handed on the government. Like, the government can't limit speech. This gets cloudy for folks because leaders of private companies like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk saying that, like, we want to provide free speech. Everybody should have free speech. When they talk about it, what they're really talking about is an ethic of free speech, not their legal obligation under the First Amendment. Private companies are allowed to limit speech. Like, your employer can tell you to not put a bumper sticker on your car. And like, the government can't do anything about the bumper sticker on your car, but your employer can fire you. So private companies like Facebook and Twitter, they have the right to moderate what's on their platforms, to take things down. And they do that, especially regarding things like sexual abuse or drug content, things like that. Things that are not necessarily legal, but they find them unsavory, unpleasant for their users. And so they moderate those and take those down. Same thing they could do that with false and misleading content. And they have to various degrees over the years. They're also actually extra protected by a law, Section 230. of the Communications Decency Act, which was enacted in the 90s to limit the liability of these tech platforms. So they're not only allowed to moderate content by this law, but they're also protected from anybody who sues them for what somebody posts on their platform. So even if they don't moderate, they're not liable. They're like protected every which way.
That's pretty incredible. I understand the right of free speech and in a private company scenario that there's limitations there. A lot of these platforms are now talking about, especially on X, like you hear it all the time, like we are now the media, we are now the press, you are the press. What is the difference, I guess, between what would be considered free press and free speech?
No, I mean, the First Amendment outlines 5 like specific rights, and people don't typically remember that's like 5 separate things in there, but it's like First Amendment is freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, like to gather, and freedom to petition your government for redress. So freedom of speech, there's a huge body of case law on like what is speech and what can the government regulate. You know, one of the points I make in this AdExchanger article is that it's not only like what the government can tell you like not to say, it can also not compel you to say something. Like within free speech, there's just all these sort of subsections and nuances and like what is speech and what's not, who has speech, corporations, people, etc. And the freedom of the press is the right of journalists to go out and investigate and write and publish things that they discover that are true. They have quite a bit of protection around that without being like jailed again by the government, you know, without having that right restricted by the government. So there isn't a definition of like what constitutes a press in the Constitution, and there's actually little to no case law on like what is the press. And as you see in this modern information landscape, who is a journalist? To your point, like we are the media, we are the press. You have journalists, you have news influencers. There's no barrier to entry. Like you don't have to have a journalism degree. You don't have to have a certain credential or experience in order to be practicing doing the practice of journalism. So to the extent it would be contested, it would be pretty widely applied. Like the work that a lot of folks do to bring truth to audiences would be considered the work of the press and protected.
What direction do you think things are heading in? I guess the political space is pretty heated up, if that's the right term. And it goes across the entire spectrum, like depending on where you sit on that political scale. What is the direction, the way publishers and news sources are changing over the next few years, from your opinion?
It's really divergent. It really depends on what the purpose of the publisher is. And different publishers have to define the things that they're going for. I mean, over the last 30 years, the prominence of like really partisan media is proliferated so much because it's so fragmented. So if you want to make money, if you wanted to gain influence, there are some slower and faster ways to do that, especially if you're small. Like if you're just one person with a podcast or a website, a newsletter, it's just you and maybe a handful of folks that you work with. One of the fastest ways to gain an audience is to put out like really vitriolic content, like very partisan content. You can find, if you can get an audience of 100,000 people or 1 million people, you can really make some money with that. And user-generated content platforms have really made that easier for folks, like YouTube, all social media, podcast platforms, etc. And it's so different from what large news organizations have done in the past. Now, large news organizations like large national newspapers or like TV broadcasters, even local papers that have a few dozen reporters, you know, they now compete for attention with everyone else, with like the solo and small. And so, you know, there are good things and bad things about that, but it's really required a lot of adjustment by the larger ones, and sometimes in directions that have not been super beneficial. So if a large news outlet that has hundreds of journalists is like, oh no, we got to compete with these like podcasters, then they might just publish more opinion. They might publish more biased stuff. And that has led to a loss, like the prevalence of biased opinion in news outlets is really strongly related to the reduction in trust. Because if you publish a bunch of left-leaning opinion, then folks on the right are not going to trust you. If you publish a bunch of right-leaning opinion, folks on the left aren't going to trust you. And they're not going to trust you for your journalism, the journalism that's like not meant to be biased. It's meant to be straightforward. So I don't know if this is truly where this is going. It's gotten fragmented. It will continue to get more fragmented probably before it consolidates again. But like any industry, there's often periods of fragmentation and then reconsolidation. You see it in streaming, you see it in everything. And news outlets, what I hope is that the larger ones that have like editorial infrastructure really focus in on the work that they can uniquely do, which is journalism. Like anybody can publish opinion. It's a commodity. Like you don't need to have a editorial staff to do that. Not everybody can do journalism because not everybody can deploy to a like extreme weather zone or a war zone or do FOIA requests that take 6 months, So I hope they focus on that.
You make a really good point that the growth of social media, the ease of entry for anyone to be able to create a very simple, website and start publishing content and then utilizing their audience to monetize is literally what I did. So being able to, build the audience, generate the content, distribute that content, and monetize is really what we do. But you're right, the journalism piece, right? Let's forget about the articles, the opinion pieces, the newsletters, the conversations. The journalism piece, I can see getting drowned out because of strong biases. If there's a particular news source that I necessarily don't agree with or doesn't have the same views as I do politically, I don't visit that site to look at the weather, and I don't look at that site to look at the report. I go to the one that I'm confident in for other news types. So I could see that playing a role.
Yeah. And we all have the same finite attention. Like our information sources expanded greatly. We each still have the 24 hours in the day and the time we set aside to consume that content.
Right. And even content consumption has changed. I did a lot of research before I started doing this with Ari, and one of the big parts is that, different generations consume content differently. The attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. If you look at the 18 to 25, they consume content very differently than 26 to 40. Video is in, audio is in, really written is very short attention span. Headline, couple lines of the article, they get an idea and they move on. So it'll be interesting to see how those biases roll into different types of content, including podcasts and newsletters and one-off websites.
It's really easy to turn up the bias in video and audio content just because of the format. The reason I say that is if you look at our chart, when you want to find the stuff that's in the bottom corners, most biased, least reliable, you find more of it on podcasts and YouTube.
How do you work with advertisers? So this is a podcast about AdTech and advertisers. How does your company work with advertisers? What do you provide them in terms of solutions or insights?
We provide our data to advertisers, brands and agencies primarily via AdTech platforms, DSPs, SSPs, to help them identify news sources that they'd want to advertise in. And it's all about getting ad dollars back to reliable news. Over the last 10-ish years, the pendulum has really swung away from advertisers investing in news. The funny story about getting into the advertising industry itself, let alone ad tech, I didn't have any background in the advertising industry. And somebody saw what I was doing and they said, that data that you have on what's reliable and biased, that could really help with brand safety. And I was like, oh, cool. What's brand safety? I'm like,
right.
Oh, what a weird phrase. And they had to sort of explain the entire ad industry to me. But the idea that you don't want your ads showing up next to yucky content on the internet, violence or sexually explicit content. And I said, oh, so this could help them avoid misleading content or really highly polarizing. Yes. And I thought, okay, great. So as soon as I started going to brands and agencies saying, hey, we can help you avoid this kind of unsavory stuff, they're like, oh, that's nice, but that's not really a problem for us because we just don't advertise in news anymore. And I was like, what?
Yeah, that's
what do you
not
mean
good
you
either.
don't advertise in news? It's 25 to 33% of the content on the internet, on TV, on podcasts, no matter the format. It's a big chunk of the content. What do you mean you don't advertise there? And then I started to see the damage that was really doing. They're like, oh, well, we have these brand safety tools and they just, we just block the keywords or the sites. And I didn't think, as an outsider, that seemed really wrong and damaging. And it is. Look what's happening to news outlets. And it just so happens that you should advertise in news because journalism is like a pillar of democracy. So that's the pro-democracy case for advertising in news. Happens to be that if you advertise in high quality news, it's better for the brand. The metrics are just much better on campaigns that run in news, in high quality news, than campaigns that do not. Unfortunately, there's a lot more good news content out there than junk news content. It's not necessarily intuitive because the misleading, highly biased, very polarizing content is very loud and it has a huge effect on our society. It makes it seem like everything is on fire and falling apart, and it is highly responsible for that. However, the scale of the advertising opportunities is overwhelmingly in the good news content.
It's funny, you mentioned something about keyword blocking. I just ran a poll about that on LinkedIn and how, it's pretty inaccurate. I think the example I used was, if you block the word shoot, do you accidentally block basketball content? In your case, there are people who are blocking entire news outlets, which I get that they may have some sort of perception or opinion on that news outlet. But even keyword blocking is flawed. And that list can be really, really wide and just eliminate so much good inventory and high performing inventory rather than really scoping it and going deep into, okay, what is the analysis of these keywords? What's the tone analysis of these keywords? What is this word followed by if there's basketball or NBA or professional athlete's name or team? Let it slide because then they're talking about a basketball game or content. But it's pretty incredible that even till today, the keyword blocking is still a strategy done rather than a more detailed analysis of the content to decide where your budgets go.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of inertia. Once a practice gets put into place, it's hard to extract it. People know it's a problem, but in order to solve it and put something new in place, just takes some effort. And advertising professionals are very busy. There's a lot of things to think about. So making it easy is one of our big focuses. If it's not easy to do, we can have been talking about this problem for the last 5 years. I think Suzanne Veronica wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about this exact keyword issue shot in 2019. That's almost 6 years ago,
Yeah, still a problem.
So, yeah.
Still happening. It's pretty incredible. So Vanessa, I really enjoyed having you with me today. I have one last question for you. What's a viewpoint that you have about the ad tech industry that you think most people would disagree on?
That sentiment analysis doesn't matter very much. I'll expand just a little bit on it, especially when it comes to news. News is mostly negative, and it's important that it's negative. We need to know what's not working and what things are going wrong. It's a survival mechanism. This negativity bias is not a bad thing. And there's this assumption that you want to advertise just around positive things and not around negative things because of how people feel, but it's not well supported by data. And folks pay a lot of attention to negative stuff. I mean, look at engagement on social media. Most of it is highly, highly negative, but people don't question their, the performance of the ad investments does so well, right? So the application of sentiment to say oh, well, let's add sentiment to news and we'll only advertise around positive stories about the war. That doesn't even make any sense. It's important to read about the war. And yes, the war is negative. We need to know about it. People are paying attention to that extremely, extremely important content. And when your ad is around there, they notice it.
I don't even know what to say because that was a great perspective. I loved it. Thank you for sharing that.
I try not to be contrarian on everything just for the sake of it, but that one I do feel strongly about.
You know what? I'm always shocked by the answers people give me. That one was really good. I had someone tell me, I don't know why everybody hates Google. And I thought that was an interesting response. But thank you again for being here. And thanks again for your time today.
My pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the AdTech GodPod, a podcast for the people, about the people. Stay connected with me for more insights, trends, and interviews in the realm of AdTech. Don't miss out on the latest updates, so follow me on X, Instagram, and connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't forget, ATG Slack community has insights, networking opportunities, and jobs. Keep the conversation going and stay at the forefront of AdTech innovation.